Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I have the great pleasure of being with Faisal Ahmed. He's associate professor at Wellesley College, and he's the author of Conquests and Rents, a political economy of dictatorship and violence in Muslim societies. Today we're going to be talking with him about this book and his career. Faisal, how are you?
Good, thanks, Javier. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm very, very happy of having you here. I was very excited um, when I saw that the book came out, and it took us a while to schedule this conversation, but I'm very happy that we were finally able to do it. And before getting into the book, I would like to ask you about your life and your career. And you've had a very interesting path, and in what are the intersections of economics and political science. You have not only worked on the history of Muslim societies, but you're also interested in international macroeconomics. You even
Mhm.
have an ancient past on multilateral agencies. So tell me a bit about your life and the path that your career has followed.
Yeah, so maybe I should start from the beginning of my life. So,
Please.
I am a native of Bangladesh. I was born in Dhaka, and sort of growing up, I split time. So I grew up primarily in London in the UK, and split time between sort of the UK during the academic year and then Dhaka during the summer. My family moved to the States at the beginning of high school. So I've sort of traveled a lot sort of around the Muslim world. I was very, very fortunate, and sort of a lot of my sort of exposure from an early age has sort of led me to sort of ponder like why the Muslim world has sort of gone the way that it has. But so before going to that, then let me just talk about just my sort of professional sort of trajectory and sort of. So I'm actually an economist by training, and sort of coming out of undergraduate, sort of my first couple of jobs were pretty much in economic policy making. So I worked at the Federal Reserve for a couple of years, and there I was doing sort of macroeconomics and forecasting and things like that. And then I spent a year at the Council of Economic Advisors in DC, working on issues, topics in international macro, trade, finance, and um, some agricultural things as well. And then so I made the transition into academia. And so my research is primarily in political economy, and so I went sort of more on the political science route. And so that's where I am sort of like much of my earlier work has sort of explored the relationship between sort of like international financial transfers, thinking of the role of foreign aid, remittances, foreign direct investment, sovereign borrowing, and how that sort of affects policy making in developing countries, particularly in sort of non-democracies. And sort of some of that work has sort of led me to sort of study sort of subsequent patterns of political and economic development in Muslim societies, which is sort of the focus um, of my recent book.
And tell me more about that transition, and I mean the transition of your research agendas. I
Mhm.
mean, I can totally see the thematic proximity, but still, it feels that you're fitting into a different community when you're talking about the conquest in the Islamic world versus
Mhm.
international transfers
Yeah.
today. Have you struggled a bit with that? Have you managed to deal with the different communities, and has that been a
Um,
problem for your like academic identity? How do you deal with that?
um, so maybe it does have a okay, so maybe it does sort of have some issue with my academic identity. Sort of I consider myself sort of an international economist that happens to study sort of like political outcomes, right? And I've always sort of been interested in sort of understanding how the international macroeconomy affects economics and politics. When I was working at the Council of Economic Advisors, I sort of got a sort of real world sort of example of like sort of how politics really intervenes in thinking about how governments think about trade, finance, investment, and things like that. And so what was fun about working on this particular project was really sort of digging into the historical aspect of Muslim society. So in some of my earlier work, I sort of explore how foreign aid and remittances affect corruption, autocracy, like low levels of economic development growth. And sort of an empirical component of that is really studying patterns in Muslim societies. And so that then led me to think about, okay, so then why are Muslim countries different than non-Muslim countries, right? Sort of like in the sort of economic growth literature, we often run regressions where there's a Muslim dummy, and the Muslim dummy is always negative and significant. So the question is like, what exactly is going on in that Muslim dummy? And so this project is sort of trying to explore like really what's unpack that Muslim effect. And sort of in sort of investigating that, I sort of recognize that there's really there are subtle differences between different parts of the Muslim world. Like countries in the Middle East and North Africa are very different than countries sort of, that are also Muslim majority in South Asia and Southeast Asia. So Pakistan, Bangladesh, the context that I'm very familiar with, but also Indonesia, Malaysia, which are also which are Muslim majority, but where you sort of seen episodes of higher economic growth, periods of them being democratic, and sort of, that's then to think about. So like what explains that variation within the Muslim world? And so then studying that, looking into that, sort of one historical approach was thinking about the way in which Islam spread. And so that's the nature of the book, thinking about societies in which Islam spread through military conquest, which is basically the focus of the book, but then also societies in the Muslim world where Islam spread through other means, primarily through trade and Sufi clerics and things like that. And there, sort of the dynamics are very different in the modern era.
Let's talk about that then. Give us some context about how Islam spread
Mhm.
across the world. What's the history of this process so we can have an idea of how
Sure.
your theoretical argument
Yeah.
follows.
Yeah. So to sort of start off with, the book sort of separates the world between conquest and non-conquest societies. And non-conquest societies will cover many Muslim majority countries today, but also countries in Europe, South America, and things like that. So the general gist is sort of after the death of Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD, Islam spread, and it spread relatively quickly within the next 150, 200 years. It spread to what we consider sort of the modern Middle East, right? North Africa, the Middle Eastern countries, the Persian Gulf, but then also expanded into parts of Central Asia, modern day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. It sort of hit the sort of outer skirts of Russia and China, and hit into parts of the uh, Indian subcontinent. In the first 150, 200 years, it spread primarily through military conquest, meaning that sort of the early expansion of Islam was through armies. So started out in the Arabian Peninsula and then sort of spread out radially. And so by basically the year 750, 800, much of sort of the modern Middle East, parts of Central Asia, were conquered by Muslim armies. And in these early sort of conquest societies, um, um, there was basically Muslim armies were on the outside of the major cities, and they sort of governed those cities. Those early populations did not necessarily sort of convert to Islam. That took multiple centuries. In other parts of the Muslim world, so in parts of sort of West Africa today, Islam also was adopted. Uh, but the reason for adoption was very different. There, it wasn't so much of the expansion uh, of uh, of Muslim armies, but sort of the decision by elites in those societies to adopt Islam as a way of gaining access to the lucrative trade routes. And so today in sort of Nigeria, Niger, Mali, which are Muslim majority today, they're sort of like the early conversion to Islam was not through sort of the expansion of armies, but through adoption of trade. And sort of similar dynamics played out much later in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century in sort of modern day Indonesia and Malaysia. So in the period of sort of the Muslim conquest, which I sort of look from basically, after the death of the Prophet in 632 up until about 1100, much of the Muslim world, the modern Muslim world, was conquered by these Muslim armies. And in order for the caliphate to govern, they needed to establish certain types of institutions. And so in the book, I talk about one institution in particular, this use of Mamluk soldiers. So The early caliphate, headquartered primarily in Baghdad and Damascus, um, imported soldiers from the Caucasus to help sort of maintain this caliphate sort of repressive capacity. Um, and these soldiers were what we call slave soldiers in the sense that they were loyal to the sultan. In exchange for their service, the sultan granted the Mamluks temporary land grants, which they then used to sort of tax the local population to get rents. Um, an interesting feature of these sort of Mamluk institutions was the fact that Mamluks could not pass on their wealth to their children. Upon the end of their sort of service to the Sultan, the land would transfer back, and the Sultan would then get a fresh new crop of sort of Mamluk soldiers coming in from Eastern Europe. Um, so this sort of created this system of Mamluk soldiers and this method of compensating them called Ikta. And then basically by the 10th century, the Sultan was also able to sort of co-opt the ulema, the religious clerics, into sort of justifying their form of rule. And sort of what I argue in the book is by 1100 or so, there was this sort of what I call this classical Islamic equilibrium that resulted, where you had a configuration of the Sultan working with the Mamluk soldiers and the ulema to basically have this form of Islamic rule. And this institutional sort of apparatus sort of has continued up until basically the modern era. And I talk about sort of the role of sort of subsequent European colonialism and how they built on the existing infrastructure in many of these societies.
Right. So, I mean, this context is very useful, I think, for people to understand what exactly you're trying to argue. But so before getting into the details of how your theory
Mhm.
works, I'd like to take a step back and talk about this empirical regularity that motivates your big question, right? Which is that this Muslim fix effect that you were talking about, right?
Mhm.
That on average, Muslim countries are less democratic and more violent, right? And I want you to tell us a bit more about that. What does that means exactly, and why then you think, and this is going to very rapidly get back to your historical
Mhm.
understanding of the process of expansion of Islam, why a good explanation for that regularity is not something inherent to Islam,
Mhm.
right? So why is it not just the attributes of the faith, for instance? So yeah, tell us a bit about that big empirical regularity and why this, let's call it conventional explanation doesn't work, and why do we need the theory that you propose?
Sure. Um, so the book starts off and sort of motivated by looking at sort of the contemporary Muslim world, looking at sort of post 1960, how have Muslim societies been governed and what's the level of economic development? So the book starts off by saying, look, we sort of observe in the data that countries that tend to experience civil war and that are non-democratic tend to have lower levels of economic development, right? And lower growth. So that sort of explains, that sort of ties into that sort of Muslim dummy effect that we sort of observe in the macroecon literature. Then I then say, okay, then so we know that sort of like, development is negatively correlated with dictatorship and negatively correlated with civil war. And then it goes on to say, oh, but look, in the Muslim world, they tend to be more predisposed to being dictatorships relative to non-Muslim countries. And they also are more prone to conflict. So in any given year, for instance, 5% of Muslim countries are experiencing like major civil war with at least 1,000 battle deaths a year, while in the non-Muslim world, that's about 2%. So, Muslim societies are two times more likely to sort of experience high levels of violence. So the question is then sort of like what explains this variation in dictatorship and violence that we observe in the Muslim world? Then the book then sort of shifts to saying, look, what we know in the Muslim world, that there's periods of variation, So in the 1970s, many Muslim countries were very authoritarian. And then in the mid 80s, early 1990s, and since, they've been more prone to conflict. So, like, what explains that dynamic? So the book then sort of takes this approach. We're thinking about, all right, well, what explains like the cross-sectional variation between Muslim and non-Muslim? And then what explains the within country variation in violence and dictatorship within the Muslim world, right? And so that gets me to sort of my two independent variables in the book, looking at conquest. So looking at the way in which Islam spread sets up this historical legacy of having sticky sort of institutions in the modern era. And then thinking about how variation in various forms of economic and often some sort of geopolitical rents, which I talk about in the book, affect patterns of violence, dictatorship, and democracy. So we see episodes, for instance, that some Muslim countries transition between periods in which they're autocratic and democratic. So examples would be Pakistan. In the 1970s, they had a military dictatorship. In the mid 80s, early 1990s, they transitioned to democracy. Towards the late 1990s, early 2000s, we had military dictatorship, and now we sort of see a transition back into democracy, albeit not sort of, fully functional democracy, right? So then what explains that variation, right? Or think about Indonesia. From the 1960s up until the late 1990s, Indonesia was a military dictatorship. And then post 97, after the Asian financial crisis, they sort of transitioned to being democratic. So what explains that variation in those countries? But then sort of the staunch sort of levels of dictatorship that we observe in the Middle East. So Saudi Arabia has been a dictatorship, you know, has been a monarchy since they gained independence. A country like Syria, for instance, has started out sort of democratic, was now a dictatorship, and now has experienced civil war over the past decade or so, right? So why in those contexts do we observe these sorts of sort of negative outcomes, while in other parts of the Muslim world we don't? And that's why I sort of think that the variation in economic rents sort of might explain this. And by economic rents, in the book, I explore the role of oil revenues and foreign aid primarily.
Okay, so now let's try then to connect all these pieces, right? So you're saying, okay, there's this cross-sectional variation, which the Muslim world appears as more prone to conflict and less democratic. Static sort of interpretation as a natural one that would be intuitive to argue that it's something related to Muslims or to Islam as a faith. Doesn't seem to be a great explanation because there's also variation within the Islamic world, and you describe that there's a fundamental difference there in terms of how Islam arrived to each of these societies, right? And you already mentioned these Mamluk institutions and how they structurally shape differently these places. But then you brought this new element that it's variation across time, and you introduced this concept of rents, right? So how do these two things connect? What type of institutions generated what under the arrival of new, or well, you make reference to the decline of rents, right? So but what's that story then? How does your theory connect this different type of institutions that emerge through the arrival of Islam through different mechanisms um to the interaction in the long term
Sure,
of
sure,
states with these different rents?
sure. Um, so chapter two of the book provides sort of an analytical framework linking that tries to establish how societies may transition from democracy to autocracy and vice versa, and why we might see episodes of civil war. So the general sort of analytical framework starts off from existing models of state capacity. Tim Besley and Thorsten Pearson have these a series of papers sort of exploring the dynamics of state capacity. And so the book starts off with this general framework thinking about, okay, in any society, there are basically two groups. There's an incumbent and an opposition. And within society, there's some sharing rule in which the incumbent shares government resources with the opposition, right? So these sharing rules could be formalized through, explicit fiscal rules that specify that everyone gets public goods. It could be more informal in the sense that, we know sort of in societies that are ethnically fragmented, if you are a co-ethnic of the incumbent, you're more likely to get more public goods from the incumbent relative to if you're a non-co-ethnic, right? So the book starts off with the analytical framework starts off with that premise and then says, okay, when so societies, there are two groups, opposition and the incumbent. There's a sharing rule. In the model, the sharing rule is exogenous, and this is where I'll tie in the conquest. Uh, and then it says that, okay, when a government receives high levels of rents, so think about non-tax government revenue. So this could be oil revenue, could be foreign aid. In the book, I also argue this could be geopolitical support in the sense that it could be a credible commitment by an external power to intervene in that country if the opposition mounts an insurgency. So general gist of the model is that when the incumbent has a lot of rents, it's in the position to finance a large army that can deter the opposition from fighting. It can also allow the state to engage in repressive practices, right? What that means then in societies then that receive high levels of rents, there may be a predisposition towards being a dictatorship, especially in those societies in which the sharing rules are not egalitarian. Um, then it says that, okay, when those rents decline, the government's resources decline, and it's in a more vulnerable position for the opposition to attack. And particularly when rents decline in societies in which um, the sharing rules are not egalitarian, uh, they're more predisposed to exhibiting a civil war. Okay, so then how does this tie into the concept of conquest? Well, in the model, this notion of sharing is exogenous. And so empirically, then I explore in the Muslim world what might explain this propensity of governments not to share resources. And then I argue, well, it's because of these of the way in which societies were conquered, those that were exposed to this classical Islamic equilibrium, today in the modern era tend to be less democratic. And we sort of know in the literature that societies that are less democratic, the governments tend to spend a lot less on public goods and are less likely to sort of spend on opposition, right? So what then I then argue in the book, empirically, I show then, okay, societies that were exposed to conquest tend to be less democratic today. So given that sort of static difference between Muslim and non-Muslim or conquest and non-conquest, I then say, okay, now having shown that, how can we then explore variations in rents? And so part three of the book looks at the what happens in conquest societies when rents vary. So there's a chapter looking at countries that produce oil, and there the analysis sort of shows that in those societies, higher levels of oil revenues tend to make them less democratic, and when they experience declines in revenues, they become more prone to conflict. In contrast, in non-conquest oil-producing countries, when they experience high levels of rents, they either sort of remain dictatorships or they remain democratic. But interestingly, when they experience declines in rents, they're more likely to experience transitions to democracy. And so in the chapter, for instance, I talk about Nigeria being an example. So Nigeria is a Muslim majority country today, but in which Islam did not spread through military conquest. And so Mamluk institutions weren't imprinted into that society, 1,000 years ago. Rather, Islam spread through trade, where these Mamluk institutions weren't uh, implanted. In the modern era, therefore, according to my argument, they should have institutions that are more likely to be sharing institutions. And in Nigeria, as an example, where sort of in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when rent started to decline, oil revenue started to decline, Nigeria sort of transitioned away from a military dictatorship towards having more democratic governance, right? And so that's how I'm sort of tying in this notion of conquest to sort of explain the propensity or the prevalence of sort of non-sharing institutions in many Muslim societies today, and then exploring how variations in these different types of economic rents affects transitions between democracy, autocracy, and violence.
I want to ask you about how you think that your theory fits other ideas about that try to explain this big regularity regarding how autocratic could be the Muslim world. But before that, I want to ask you more about your methods because it's a very interesting paper in the sense that it has formal theory, it has a lot of history, and it has well, quantitative, like
Mm,
econometric
mm,
analysis of empirics. And I want to ask you about that, about the decision of following that approach. Why did you approach to it through a formal model, for instance,
mhm.
thinking about the theory, and why not just sort of like narrative type of theory, or more, I don't know how to call the type of models that are very
Mhm.
common in political science, where you have the squares and categories, and
Yeah.
and then how did you feel working with historical data? To you have a diff and diff method
Mhm.
as your main
Yeah.
specification and so on. Um, Considering that, well, the type of sources that we have in history, although, well, information is fairly good
Mm.
actually for the Caliphate period and so on. But anyways, what was your, I guess this is a personal question about your
Mhm.
experience approaching methodologically this question that is so challenging in so many ways.
Yeah. So I came into this project sort of like there's been a lot of recent very good work looking at sort of how Islam and sort of the origins of Islam, or the Sharia law, the equilibrium that I sort of described, have sort of explained, you know, why the Muslim world tends to be less developed relative to the non-Muslim world, right? And so much of this literature is sort of, thinking about, why did the West rise, right? Why did Europe rise and the Muslim world remain stagnant, right? And so I'm coming into that, I sort of agree with that to a certain extent, but then I sort of notice that there's variation within the Muslim world, right? So there are some countries that experience growth, that experience democracy. So it's not as static as we think it is, right? So that's why I think sort of, one sort of innovation of the book project is this introduction of like rents and sort of explaining some of this within country variation that some of the existing sort of work by economic historians and political scientists don't sort of fully unpack, right? So, Timu Kuran has an excellent book from a decade ago looking at the role of like Sharia. Um,
He has a
uh,
new, I mean, last year he published a book. We had him here,
Yeah,
so
yeah. So he has a recent book as well. And then Jared Rubin and Amit Kuru have two excellent books in the last 5 years that have also explored this dynamic. But all of those books sort of have this sort of static interpretation that like there was something that happened, Islam had certain features in the early medieval period that set them on this trajectory towards being sort of underdeveloped today. Um, um, and and those books are very rich in sort of narrative, and as you sort of said, don't have this sort of formal theory to underlie it. Um, so as I was thinking about how do I tie in the concept of this historical component with the variation in rents, on the rent side of the story, there's been a lot of sort of work exploring how variation in government finances affect transitions, how variation in government and public finance affect patterns of dictatorship and democracy or violence, right? But they haven't sort of tied in how we might see transitions from democracy to dictatorship and vice versa through violence, right? And so part of the aim of like chapter 2 in the book is to sort of develop a formal theory that sort of ties all these variables together in a very sort of sort of parsimonious framework. Um, what you mentioned that political scientists usually have those 2 by 2 boxes, and so I have that in the opening chapter. So I sort of lay out a very sort of non-technical framework in the opening chapter, but then chapter 2 is really like, okay, how as an economist or as a political economist can we sort of think about this in a more simplified sort of parsimonious way that links these variables up. Then in terms of like, you sort of asked me about the methodology. Um, uh, so a lot of my work really sort of my articles and stuff really tries to grapple with, how can we sort of, and this is sort of consistent with this movement in the social sciences, in the credibility revolution, thinking about how can we sort of identify causal relationships. And so, both the historical part of the book as well as the book, part of the book looking at rents, really thinks about how can we identify these effects causally. Um, and so, in the historical part, I have this section where I look at sort of like in the early parts of the period of Muslim rule expansion through military conquest, did these societies actually change? Did they tend to become more authoritarian? Now, the difficulty, as you sort of alluded to, the fact is that in historical data, we don't have these types of measures that we have in the contemporary world, right? So, we don't have a measure of democracy or autocracy in the year 700. And so what I use there in that chapter, for instance, is I look at measures of state centralization and argue that in the sort of pre-modern era, before there was this concept of what we consider modern democracy, centralization of power usually meant centralization of power within for like a autocrat, right? A caliphate or something like that, a king or a queen or something like that. So I look at patterns of state centralization in the early modern period, early medieval period between like, 600 to 1200. And so I use a different strategy and, do all the bells and whistles that come with that to basically establish that areas that were exposed to Muslim conquest became more centralized relative to non-conquest societies, right? And so I try to establish there looking at using a different diff, cognizance of issues of like parallel trends and all the other types of stuff that we have to do now to sort of justify all that, to sort of establish that at least in that period of expansion of Islam through military conquest, we actually do observe a centralization of political authority within a dictatorship. Then chapter 5 really tries to study the long-term effects of it. And so there I look at a nice sort of uh, uh, case study of the Reconquest period in medieval Spain. So Islam spread through military conquest up into the Iberian Peninsula. But then by 1100, you had the early Christian kingdoms retaking that territory. This is also a time in medieval Spain where you see the emergence of first parliaments. So in that chapter, I collected data at the provincial level on the timing of parliaments in Spain, how much territory um, was conquered by Muslim armies, and the duration of rule. And there I show in that part of that chapter that um, provinces where Muslim armies ruled for a longer time were experienced early parliament much later. So this is consistent with the argument, for instance, that you know Muslim rule set up this autocratic equilibrium that would then sort of delay the emergence of like representative institutions. And then I look at sort of the rest of the chapter looks at sort of the long run effects of Muslim conquest in the contemporary period. And that's where we have much richer data on measures of democracy, public finances. And there I basically sort of show that there's a long run effect between, societies that were conquered by Muslim armies and having sort of less government spending on opposition groups, um, you know, less democratic institutions on a variety of different ways of measuring democracy, and things like that.
That's fascinating. And let me push us even further in that direction of thinking about the very long-term consequences of your ideas and not only the immediate present, but the future of the region. And this is a way of also connecting with your broader interests on international macroeconomics today. How do you how do you see the future of the Muslim world? How do you think that your theory helps us to predict, although that's probably a very
Yeah.
strong word, but I guess to navigate the challenges um, that this part of the world is facing? Well, in
Mhm.
particular, the Middle East is such a dynamic region where so many things are happening and conflicts are every day emerging. How do you approach the reflection of the region? And
Sure.
maybe this is a good way to circle the entire conversation and reach to an end.
Yeah. Um, so in thinking about the region, we often sort of define it, in the Middle East, right, in North Africa, right? And so one aim of the project is to sort of broaden the scope of the Muslim world and think about other parts of the Muslim world, West Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And so my analysis in looking at foreign aid really sort of broadens it to thinking about other parts of the Muslim world. And so one insight is that in these societies that were conquered by Muslim armies, but that don't produce oil, when there's a decline in rents, they're more prone to exhibiting a civil war. But there's also opportunities then for when these countries come out of the civil war to have more democratic forms of governance. Okay, so that's one insight. So then what does that then imply for what we consider sort of the modern Middle East? Well, one implication is that, for instance, if we think about climate change, as the world transitions away from fossil fuels, oil revenues are going to fall in many parts of the world. And sort of what my theory predicts and what sort of other studies show is that in oil producing countries, when oil revenues decline, governments are more likely to experience civil war and a turnover in government. So then one implication then of that is for governments to prevent that from happening, they may want to undertake sort of political reforms before those rents decline. So for instance, we sort of see in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, that these governments are slowly starting to diversify their economies and come up with ways in which opposition groups are able to get some government revenues, right? So that in the future, when those rents do decline, those monarchies may not necessarily face civil war. They can still maintain political rule, but not experience the violence, right? And so that's one sort of takeaway from uh the book, and I sort of end the book on that is like, looking for in fast forward in the years, you might see some political opening in these states, but you may not necessarily see democracy in the way that we think about democracy in other parts of the world. Um, the book also sort of, suggests that, if rents do decline, then many of these societies, unfortunately, may experience high levels of violence because they just don't have ways of distributing government revenues, finances in a way that's equitable both for supporters of the government and the opposition. And so unless they come up with ways that sort of do that, then they're more predisposed to sort of experiencing violence.
Okay, that's
Yeah, so it ends on a sort of like, not so optimistic, but I sort of one thing I
it's
do sort of stress in the book is, the historical argument sort of says that, as the way in which Islam spread, um, really sort of, has a long run effect in thinking about the way that governments today share resources. Um, but one thing I do stress is that for those institutions to have the effect that they do, they need agents, right? And so you can imagine that if the preferences of the agents change, right, they can change the institutions, right? So institutions matter and they're sticky, but they're not super sticky in the sense that, individual actors can change the ways in which those institutions function. And if they make those necessary reforms, then they may be able to sort of not experience the negative sort of political outcomes that I sort of observe in the book.
right. Yeah, again, I'm trying to think about my emotions around these predictions, which are, I mean, they have an optimistic side, but they clearly highlight the potential challenges that might come um in fairly realistic scenarios. So but anyways, I think it's very insightful the way in which you look at this topic. By the way, if people are interested on this, probably they should also listen to again our podcast with Timur Kuran. It's probably a nice mix. But thank you very much. This was a fantastic conversation. I really enjoy your book. I think it does a great job thinking about the variation today and the recent history of the region. Also, I think that's you mentioned it correctly. It's a good aim to push us to reflect more broadly about the Muslim world, which is not probably the case, and the way in which, for some reason, academia has fragmented and the
Mhm.
public opinion even pays attention to the world. Um, So no, it was a very refreshing view of this. So thank you very much. I also enjoy a lot our conversation. Um, Looking forward to chatting with you in person.
Great. Thanks, Javier. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged, thank you, and take care.